Ay babo, ay babo, ay babo. Praise God, praise God, praise God. One of the questions we have tried to answer in the 20th and 21st century is, what does it mean to be human? And I want to call upon some living and ago resistors who have attempted to answer that question. I call on St. Clair, BOURNE, Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, Octavia Butler, John Lewis, Dorothy Cotton, Charlene Hunter Galt, Gloria Richardson, John Conyers, June Jordan, Cynthia McKinney, Mary McLeod Bethune, A. Philip Randolph, Herbert and Faye Aptheker, Adam Clayton Power, Geronimo Pratt, Thelonious Monk, Marion Wright Elderman, Tony K. Bambara, Kay Ball, Barbara Lee, Barbara Deming, Ann Braden, Maria Stewart, Charles Houston, William Hastings, Angela Davis, Mary Church Terrell, Sojourner Truth, Shirley Chisholm, Catherine Dunham, Bill and Camille Cosby, Elizabeth Catlett, Reverend Calvin Butts, Maurice Bishop, Nat Turner, Medgar Evers, Maya Angelou, Oprah Winfrey, Cornel West, Tavis Smiley, John Coltrane, Shirley Graham Du Bois, Gene Hudson, Mr. Michaud, Richard Moore, C.L.R. James, Gandhi, Grace and James Boggs, Nicholas Guillen, Beverly and Walter Lomax, Pablo Neruda, Gwendolyn Brooks, Mumi Young, Miriam Amina Baraka, Askia Touré, Lucille Clifton, The Last Poets, Bessie Smith, Hakeem Adabuti, Dorothy Day, Yuri Kochiyama, Billie Holiday, Margaret Burroughs, Fidel, Tupac, Rakim, Asada, Talib, Mos Def, Dead Prez, Common, Ida Wells Barnett, Betty Carter, Mfune Ella Baker, Father Paul Washington, Dolores Huerta, Chris Honey, Willie Cosicili, Oliver Tambo, The Roots, Erin Magruder, Miles Davis, Seja Shabazz, Kimako Han, Odetta, Sweet Honey in the Rock, Bernice Regan, Viney Burrows, Fannie Lou Hamer, Victoria Gray, Annie Devine, Walter Rodney, Thurgood Marshall, Charles Caldwell, Dead Prez, Afeni Shakur, Kathleen Cleaver, Audre Lorde, John Bracey, Sitting Bull, Lolita Lebron, Billy Avery, Louisa Moreno, Jose Marti Diop, Vito Marcantonio, David Walker, Margaret Walker, Alice Walker, Maxine Green, Nkrumah, Robert Sobukwe, Diana Washington, Max Roach, Ella Fitzgerald, Sarah Vaughan, Abby Lincoln, Oscar Brown Jr., Ray Charles, William Wells Brown, Sterling Brown, John Brown, Bertolt Brecht, Dottie Mama Susulu, Martin Delaney, Louis Burnham, Mandela, Nelson Mandela, Winnie, Viola Pluma, KRS-One, Dr. T.R.M. Howard, Charlene Mitchell, Lauren Hill, Cecil Gray, Toshi Regan, Julian Bond, Charlie Cobb, Harry Belafonte, Danny Glover, Duke Ellington, Abraham Heschel, Ruby Doris, Mickey James and Andy, Bob Marley, Bessie Head, Franz Fanon, Walter Mosley, Michael Weaver, Linton Kwesi Johnson, Archbishop Tutu, John Henry Clark, Barb Moses, John Killens, Queen Mother Moore, Septima Clark, Esker Infahileli, Bobby Sands, Patrick Hill, Toni Morrison, James Bowen, Grace Paley, Allen Ginsberg, George Lamming, John Hope Franklin, Sekou Sondiata, Ruby Dee and Ozzie Davis, Art Tatum, Pam Africa, Ramona Africa, Langston Hughes, W.B. Du Bois, Chinua Achebe, Eston Jim Jackson, Benjamin Davis, William Patterson, Toussaint, Desalegn, Sandino, Harry Tubman, Monroe Trotter, Edward Said, Vincent and Rosemary Harding, Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, Dick Gregory, Marcus Garvey, Paul Robeson, Albert Einstein, Lumumba, Kwame Ture, Chuck D, Frederick Douglass, Coretta Scott King, Janetta Cole, Cabral, Richard Pryor, Sherbert Mao, Nina Simone, Sun Ra, Jared Gugiwa Fiongo, Joy Harjo, Audrey Rich, Margaret Randall, Stephen Biko, Herman Ferguson, Betty Shabazz, the Rosenbergs, Assata Shakur, Malcolm, Julia Wright, Richard Wright, Bishop Camera, Leonard Peltier, Barrett Ruskin, Howard Thurman, Walt Whitman, Martin Luther King, St. Clair, BOURNE, St. Clair, BOURNE, St. Clair, BOURNE, 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 BOURNE. Jose Marti wrote, "In the world, there must be certain degrees of honor such as there must be certain degrees of light. When there are many men without honor, there are always others who bear in themselves the honor of many men. And our dear brother, St. Clair BOURNE, bore in himself the honor of many men and women as he excavated our fathers from this American dust, brought slivers of rainbows to our skins called Baraka, Clark, Parks, Hughes, Robeson, until we remembered each other's bones. Behold the filmmaker, coming out of the 60s and 70s and 80s, finding memory beneath our doors, plunging his hands into our bloodstream until he found a tourniquet of tall black trees. Behold the filmmaker, speaking to us as he heard the solitary earthquake of our breaths, his hands praying out loud as his camera danced in the eye of our pores, making us remember our blood. Continuing to do what Pablo Neruda said, good to make beauty in every corner of our house, to make life fly out of every room, and I would add good, good, good for your beautiful breath, my brother, that let all of our breaths begin the day, amen, a woman, amen. Rumi once said, we come spinning out of nothingness, gathering stars like dust. Behold the filmmaker in December, in the dark of an early morning hospital room, a splash of tremors, and he set sail in tall grass where no air stirs, his exact wings moving eastward. I shall look for you in the clouds, my brother, and hold the stars between my teeth. Behold the filmmaker.
History is a clock that people use to tell their political and cultural time of day.
If you organize, you can make them back up off you.
History tells of people where they have been and what they have been, where they are and what they are.
So I won't be singing, except for the rights of my people for the next couple of years. No pretty songs, no pretty songs.
History tells a people where they still must go, but they still must be.
This is New Orleans, a jazzy town. They don't have a curfew here. This is a party town. And people are celebrating. They come from all over the little honky-tonk towns that close at 11 o'clock at night. People jump in the car and come to New Orleans because it's jumping all night.
In the old days, black watermen used fishing methods in the fashion of their West African ancestors. Albert Atkins of Ladies Island is one of the few watermen left in the tradition.
Well, in the early days, the only way they could get across there was had to use a boat. We used to catch crab for a living, used to catch shrimp for a living, used to pick oysters for a living. Something happened to the oyster in the river. They all die out all over the place. They said it's some kind of a red water, but what it meant, I don't know exactly.
The passive resistance of Gandhi, and we should understand this, was a strategy.
I regard myself as a soldier, though a soldier of peace.
I received the inspiration to carry on in the nonviolent tradition from Jesus of Nazareth and the operational technique from Mahatma Gandhi.
The passive resistance of the civil rights movement was sold as a way of life. A strategy is never a way of life. A strategy is something you use the same as you use an orange. When the juice is gone, you throw it in the garbage can.
I got into documentary filmmaking because, number one, my father was a journalist, and I grew up in a household where information and events were part of the normal conversation. Secondly, I wanted to use the documentary to answer personal questions that I had about events and people and processes. And then finally, I like to think that the information that I give in my documentaries help people understand the elements in their lives, and hopefully they can use that information to make their lives better.
Image masters of the syncopated, wailers and drummers, wailers and trumpet stars, wailers and box cookers, wailers and sax flyers, wailers and bass thumpers, wailers and, hey, where, we wailers, trombone benders, magic singers, Ellingtonians, the only trains faster than rocket ships. Shit, cut a rocket in our pocket and put a cord on the wall of the wind. Wailers, can you dig wailing?
Fuck off, man, you foul! Get it on the rod! Get it on the rod! Just take him down! Just take him down! Give it up, asshole! Give it up! Go! Just take him down! Come on! Give it up! Watch this! Get his arm! Get his arm! Gary, that's enough! Shut up. Gary, that's enough, man! Gary, that's enough! Shut the fuck up! Gary, no!
Great. It's a reload. Randy, it's a reload.
Camera reload, guys.
Yo!
Camera reload.
All right.
I felt sorry for the kid. Just the sympathy I evoked within myself for the character helped me to be the character. It wasn't like a deep process. I mean, I'm not deep. I'm not one of them kind of Johnny Carson cats that get on Johnny and say, well, when I was preparing for Raheem, I went and lived with gang members and, had them whoop my ass a couple times so I could really see how it felt, No, I don't have to get my ass kicked to play like I don't, you know what I mean?
Oh, my baby, my curly-headed...
November 17, 1941. Dearest Carlo and Fania, we are all simply crazy about the country and have settled down permanently to country life. The house is divine.
So la 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 bye bye, in your mother's arms be creeping, and soon you'll be a-sleepin', la 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 la.
Big Paul loves the quiet and low gear of the place and flies home for every moment he can spare, even when on tour.
Or the moon to run away with, they'll come if you don't cry.
He said to me, Lloyd, what would I be doing out there? You go out of the house in Enfield, you're nowhere. Look magazine did a series on him. People want to see a man and his family, the whole thing. Those pictures were staged.
They led pretty independent lives. He would be there some of the times, but basically I think his life was rooted in New York City.
Paul Sr. never claimed that he was cut out for marriage and parenting. And there doesn't seem to have been much attention to Paul Jr. when he was growing up.
I can honestly say, for me, yeah, there were downsides. But overall, I wouldn't trade him for anybody in the universe.
As we boarded the train from Dublin to Belfast, we shared a sense of apprehension. We were leaving the realm of political and social theories. Soon we would be on the battleground. Over the next 3 days, we would hear testimony on the many aspects of life in nationalist Belfast.
Once upon a time there was Irish ways and Irish laws, villages of Irish blood, waking to the morning, waking to the morning. Then the Vikings came around, turned us up and turned us down, started building boats and towns. They tried to change our living, tried to change our living.
100 million black people at least destroyed in the slave trade, Indians stolen off the land, Latinos oppressed, Republican, Irish Catholics oppressed. All of us end up being the other. And when will humanity come to the place where it perceives that the other is indeed itself?
Once upon a time there was.
The films that I'm doing now are epic documentaries. They all take feature-length time. They involve real complex stories. So I'm trying to take the form somewhere, much like African-American musicians did with music. I'm trying to do that in a documentary.
Waking to the morning.
St. Clair, my man, St. Clair. I got an email from him, some of y'all got it too, saying he was going to have a routine that makes me cry out loud. A death stroke against any of us could be called routine. And we have all dodged such death many times, death from crazy America or crazy Americans, and they could line up as candidates to be the newest devil. We could elect them, they say. So this death, almost like a killing of St. Clair, pardon me, I cannot say otherwise. My tongue is stuck too deep in my paranoid Negro mind. I'm not blaming anybody but the backwardness of all of this, including ourselves, who stand by millennium after millennium and watch our prophets slain or minimally character assassinated. But Saint was much harder to stop than that. Is this Shakespearean? Because I must pause. Even as I write this, I love this brother so. I really love St. Clair, BOURNE, so. And gagged, actually, and burst into tears when the death notice was thrown at me through the telephone. But it must be. This wail needs to be greater than the dead have given for the dead. If we would, for that brief moment of our collective recall, actually remember and conjure the breathing life of this great brother, who was called a saint at birth, and not as a title given by dusty corporate inventors of celestial hoaxes. The brother in his being. You remember the nearly shy and always ready to grin St. Clair? A great being of clarity, St. Clair, who made us smile when we saw him coming. Hey, man. We'd say to each other, hey, man. With that deep sincerity of brothers ignoring to our maximum capability the poisonous rule of evil which surrounds us and even calls us out of our names. You could tell he was a grand being of clarity, not merely by his speech, but by his work. Saint created new worlds which reflected this world. Actually, the worlds that Saint made were much hipper than this one. Can I get a witness?
The world Saint made were much, much hipper than this one. And this is like a sermon, too, and an elegy and a eulogy for my gone brother, St. Clair Bourne. You knew him, St. Clair Bourne, the filmmaker. And for us black people, certainly for us Afro-American, us black Americans, I know that stings to hear that, but face it, this is exactly what we are, double consciousness and all. That Saint could speak to the whole of us, from both sides of that River Jordan or the River Styx that seems to separate us sometimes from ourselves. Saint dug that both sides of ourselves make one whole gleaming blackness, that we were black as the Africa of our history and our present, but we're also American. Dog it. Americans who, as Du Bois said, built this sucker on a humble without getting paid, except with stripes and blows which made us see stars who we must finally one day dig are our black selves. The history of St. Clair Bourne, the filmmaker. Let the church say amen, a message from the holy mouth of our still living past, as the church has been our way, where we take Jesus as our professional faith. It was, I think, in the late 60s I first heard Saint's name when Black Journal arrived, out of the striving of the 60s, a program on national educational television put together by black filmmakers. And remember that it was our struggle that created these new openings in the world. A couple of years later, St. Clair had come to Newark. He documented the beginnings of our organizing and struggles in Newark. His footage on the Spirit House, the Committee for Unified Newark in the 70s, and in 1982, the film Amity Baraka in Motion. I was going on trial for resisting arrest. Arrest for what, is the question. But one part of this film I will remember to the end of my life is our little daughter, Shani, coming to the door during the filming, and he caught it asking, can she keep some stray dog who'd wandered in? I'll feed it, she says. Now both of them are dead. Saint did films about black culture, and particularly about those who identified themselves with the Afro-American struggle for equal rights and self-determination. Paul Robeson, Langston Hughes, with a strong emphasis on black artists and scholars who used their work to tell the story and send a message. Gordon Parks, John Henry Clark, even had an unreleased film on Dr. Ben that was stalled. The film The Black and the Green, where Saint took a group of black movement people to Ireland, happened because he was filming a demonstration at the South African consulate by black activists joined by Irish members of Northern Aid who were invited to highlight the British role in both Irish and South African oppression. I had invited him there, and Saint was quick to get the connection, and in a minute had taken some black folks in his film team to Ireland. It was the similarity of those struggles that appealed to him. It seems pro-IRA, the usual nitpickers pick. When I do films about black struggle, they seem pro-black too, was Saint's answer. St. Clair reminded us as well of the seasons of our life, where we've been, what we've done or tried to do. Just a month ago, Saint called, he wanted to do a film of a jazz opera called The Sisyphus Syndrome that the jazz great David Murray and I are doing in May in Oakland. So this leaving of saints is a deep sadness that means the full trees of our grandest existence begin to fall. To leave as the summers of our lives turn to the red-brown drift of autumn, a lived-out September song. Ironically, Saint's greatness was recognized in the Black Journal days by Bill Greaves, who knew him in the Black Journal and now remains one of the only black documentary filmmakers of similar depth and breadth. Saint's going tells us there is a generation leaving, a grand generation. A few months ago, we buried the great Max Roach, and just before that, the wonderful poet Sekou Sundiata. A few months before that, I wrote 4 tough goodbyes, eulogies for Jackie McLean and John Hicks and Hilton Ruiz and Halim Suleiman, a great generation, one that included Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, Jimmy Baldwin, Robert Williams, John Coltrane, Miles Davis, Sarah Vaughan, Billie Holiday. St. Clair Bourne was one of those, just as we witnessed all those greats together and also through his eyes. At one point, we could see all of them on the same day. A grand generation is passing from the stage, and so we must demand a fitting legacy from our loins and the loins of the world. What St. Clair Bourne has done is prove a legacy for those who preceded him as well as for those who move with him through the world, and so leave a history for those wise enough to understand that what he did was create a path, a trail of life that followed, could help someone trace and find themselves in this authentic hell where this is both capital and decapital. It will be hard to, no, impossible to go on without constantly remembering Saint and overhearing the hundreds of conversations we had. I never thought that this would happen. I never thought that there would be a time when St. Clair BOURNE wasn't on the set. And I'll never get used to it. Tributes, remembrances, and reflections. We're going to hear now from an old high school friend of St. Clair's, who was also the best man at his weddings, to Noah Rogers.
Good evening. You can talk back to me. How do you talk about your best friend? It's not easy once they're gone. The marvel of our friendship is that from the day we met, we never lost contact. I got a call from Saint when he was in Memphis in mid-November, and in his inevitable way, he would say, "Hey, T, I've got a problem." I said, "What's up?" He said, "I'm in the emergency room." I said, "Well, what's up?" He said, "I've been fainting and having numbness in one part of my body." He said, "I'll call you back." An hour later, I got a call back that he was stable and they were going to let him go and he would come back to New York and see me then. But they discovered that he had a brain tumor, which he knew about for 12 years and didn't tell anybody. That's not true. He told me. On Thanksgiving Day, we had dinner at Riverside here. It was minimal because we were both late for the dinner, but we enjoyed the company. And then about a week later, first week in December, I got a call from Saint and hospital in Brooklyn, Long Island College Hospital. And he said, "T, I'm back in the emergency room." I said, "Oh boy." So I got in the car and I went to the hospital and didn't look bad. In fact, he was making jokes and marveling at the chaos in the emergency room. And so we didn't like the scene. In fact, the doctor said that he wanted to operate right away because he saw the tumor and we should take care of it. And Saint said, "No, I don't think so." And so a number of us got together and we started to begin to strategize of how to get Saint in what we thought was a better place. And we got him moved to New York Presbyterian. And I must say, I think that the care that he got there was excellent. The doctors were excellent. The staff was excellent. And Saint looked very funny in the bed because he had a row of staples from the front to the back of his head. And what little hair he had left started growing back in around the staples. So Saint was, as always, the producer. He was the guy that challenged the doctors and told one doctor that the other doctor said he didn't know what he was doing. And so on Thursday, December 14th, Saint started having breathing problems. And to give hopefully an accurate description, they were trying to thin his blood out because clots were forming, and they were trying to find the balance between thinning the blood and not causing a problem with his brain because it just been operated on, and they were trying to find the balance of too thin, too heavy, too thin, too heavy, and they were quite concerned. So Saint and I had our last chat that evening. I didn't know it was going to be the last evening, but we did. and we had a few observations, because Saint and I we've differed on a lot of things for a long time, practically all our lives. And he agreed with me that, he said to me, you know, I think there's such a thing as corrupt African dictators. I said, not a chance. He said, but the white man is still the one to watch. Unfortunately, Saint's DGA health insurance had run out. So Faith and Judy and I and a couple of other people were trying to figure out, how do we pay for this? How do we deal with this obstacle? And Judy discovered the miracle of Medicaid. And I said to Saint, so now you're going to say, God bless America? He said, no way. He thanked Sister Judy for pulling off the scam that got him covered at the last moment. Saint giggled like he does, like his father did before him, and then he drifted off to sleep, and I went home. 2 a.m., I got a call from Sister Judy, said Saint's gone. I didn't believe her. I couldn't believe her. I jumped in the car and went back to the hospital. And there he was, lying in the same place that I'd left him, no longer with us. I think I cried in ways that I have never cried before. And so that takes me to a place where we first met. Because I'll never forget the day when St. Clair Bourne walked down the hall of Xavier High School on West 16th Street. Let me go back a little bit. I was there for a year before. One black student in the first year and one in the senior, he didn't talk to me. So I felt very isolated, alone, fights every day in the locker room, and I wasn't a big guy then. I'm not a big guy now. I was about 4'11", and 95 pounds. But I wore this pretty uniform to school every day. And here comes Saint, and he had a friendly face, that smile. I don't remember if he said, hey man. I think he must have, because the bond was cemented at that point. We spent a year there together. I left after my sophomore year. And I think Saint might have survived a little better there. Well, 5 other brothers came in with him, and so that might have helped a little bit. But Saint would say, you know, size is always important. But our roots are deep. They're in Brooklyn. They're in early Catholic education. And we both loved our names, because we knew that when someone said Saint or Tanoa, they were only talking about us. And that was either the good stuff or the bad stuff. The late 60s caused a little rift in our relationship. His Afrocentricity and my Afro-American complicity were not so compatible. But that's okay. We crossed paths at Columbia, and he was closing down buildings. I was trying to get in the door. Saint and I had some ritual greetings which we would go through when either we were on the phone or in person, and it would go like this. The phone would ring, and I'd say, hey man, this is Saint, as if I didn't know. Did I tell you I got a grant to do another film? 3 or 4 times a month he would remind me about the grant he got for the film. But I was okay. I was with him on that. I'd call Saint, and he would say, who's this? I always thought that was funny. But I didn't mind, because I loved the brother. And then we would do our Rasta thing. We'd meet on a corner somewhere on the Upper West Side, and he would start to chant. He would say, Jah Rastafari, King of Kings, Lord of Lords, conquering Lion of the tribe of Judah, Root of David, Jah Rastafari, Haile Selassie I, and I would say, respect. So what does it mean to be a best friend? Our darkest fears and deepest secrets were intensely and openly shared and kept. Our doors were always open, and our hearts were never closed. There was always that deep sigh of pain and frustration expressed most often when we would lose the women we loved. He would say, hey, T, guess what? Was how he often began. And I would say, hey, Saint, on my side, I'm really in a lot of pain. Too often we travel to the same places at different times, but always remember to share the experience. My wedding in Jamaica went against that trend. He showed up, and I smiled, and he hugged me vigorously. In marriage, I was always his best man. We often laugh so hard and so much over silly, very silly things that the moment sometimes lapses into painful but happy tears. He never betrayed me, but I'm sorry to say that I betrayed him once. The walls that formed our differences and our friendship were many, but ultimately never threatened our friendship. And so finally, we were each other's best friend. A friendship filled with lots of love and affection that never needed an explanation. So I discovered after Saint's passing that he had sent me an email on October 10th, because in a panic, I was trying to find everything that I could to hold on to what had passed. And in this email, he said to me, he said, T, this is without a doubt and he sent it to me on his personal email, so I know it was a Nibor email address, and if I got one from there, you know it was Saint talking to you personally. He said, this is without a doubt one of the nicest good luck forwards I've ever received. I hope it works for you and for me. So I'll share this with you. One, he said, give people more than they expect and do it cheerfully. Two, marry a man, a woman you love to talk to. As you get older, their conversational skills will be more important as any other. Three, don't believe all you hear and spend all you have or sleep all you want. When you say I love you, mean it. When you say I'm sorry, look the person in the eye. Be engaged at least 6 months before you get married. I'm not so sure about that one. Believe in love at first sight. Never laugh at anyone's dreams. People who don't have dreams don't have much, and he was right about that. Love deeply and passionately. You might get hurt, but it's the only way to live life completely. In disagreements, fight fairly. No name calling. Remember, he was a big guy, so he could get away with that. Don't judge people by their relatives. Talk slowly, but think quickly. When someone asks you a question you don't want to answer, smile and ask, why don't you want to know? Why do you want to know? Remember that great love and great achievements involve great risk. Say bless you when you hear someone sneeze. When you lose, don't lose the lesson. Remember the 3 R's, respect for self, respect for others, and responsibility for all of your actions. Don't let a little dispute injure a great friendship. When you realize you've made a mistake, take immediate steps to correct it. Smile when picking up the phone. The caller will hear it in your voice. And lastly, spend some time alone. Thank you, St. Clair.
I'd like to bring up Everett Azon, who's also an old friend and a filmmaker.
The last time I saw Saint was in the hospital. And we actually joked and laughed. The doctor came in and more or less briefed Saint about what he thought was going to happen. And I said good night. I first met Saint when I invited him to screen Let the Church Say Amen at the School of Visual Arts. We hit it off immediately and have remained close for 37 years. If someone's life can be defined by what he or she has done for others, and I deeply believe it can be and is, Saint's life has been a triumph of integrity. Parallel with being an original and principled filmmaker, never concerned with trendiness or image, Saint advised, nurtured, encouraged filmmakers from the East Coast, West Coast, Central America, Africa. Because of that, I know he would want me to give recognition to someone who's here tonight who mentored him, and that's William Greaves. Several times a month, we'd meet and laugh together, talk about our lives, our work, my children who he knew. I'll miss Saint for the rest of my life.
Sylvia Azur. Now, one of the editors of Eyes on the Prize, one of St. Clair's good friends, Sam Pollard.
I first met Saint in 1980. I was recommended to him by George Bowers, another editor who had been was a close friend of Saint's, to edit a film that Saint was doing for a CBS cable station, and the name of the film was Chicago Blues. It was about the blues in Chicago, and I had known about Saint, though, from the previous 6 years when I'd been an assistant editor and a young editor, and he was always this formidable presence, this tall guy with the long leather coat and this big heavy bag, you know, and looked very forceful and formidable. And when we sat down, we started working together, I was like really sort of like intimidated by Saint. And Saint would say, after we started editing, he would say, "I'll be in the editing room tomorrow at 11 o'clock. And we'd work together. Next day would come, 11 o'clock would come, no Saint. 12 o'clock would come, no Saint. 1 o'clock, no Saint. And that would go on for the rest of the project, for the next 4 months. And I would initially say, boy, this guy could never be on time. You know, he was never on time. But from that experience, Saint and I became very close, very good friends, very good colleagues. And I would go on to edit 4 more films for Saint, Black and the Green and Langston Hughes and Half Past Autumn and On the Boulevard. And he became a mentor to me. You know, I looked up to Saint. He was my big brother, you know, because he sort of gave me a direction, you know, and made me understand the importance as an African American of telling our stories. And he was always about that. And as the years went by, Saint and I would talk 2 or 3 times a week at night, usually between 11 and midnight, talk about movies, talk about ideas, because Saint always had a new project, you know, on the burner, be it about Ernest Withers, be it about, you know, the Panthers. He always had a project, always had ideas. He always had ideas. He was always out there trying to get that next project going. You know, he was indomitable. And it was always great to just talk and just to hear Saint talk and talk about these projects. But he always had time, and he was generous, not only to me, but to Thomas Harris and Crystal Emery. He was generous to so many of us, you know, in giving us, you know, his experience, his knowledge, and his guidance in how to be better documentary filmmakers. And I'm going to miss him, and I miss him terribly. I got a note here. Someone sent this to Lou. I can't be present tonight. I would appreciate if someone would read this for me. Good evening, all. A few words, if you indulge me, from my heart. Saint was a terrific person and an inspired filmmaker. I regret not having had the opportunity of collaborating with him more often. I believe he knew better than most that the mandate of the documentary filmmaker is to expose and to help repair the fractured society we live in. For this and his wit and his friendship, Saint, we celebrate you. Mort Silverstein. Thank you.
Yeah, he's right about Saint being full of ideas constantly. Filmmaking. There's another filmmaker here, Thomas Allen Harris, who was regarded, I guess, as one of Saint's many proteges.
Good evening. I was blessed to have such a deep collaboration with St. Clair BOURNE as a mentor and a friend. Before I even met St. Clair BOURNE in the late 1980s, I had seen his film, Langston Hughes, The Dreamkeeper. And immediately I was struck by his style. It was different from other documentaries that I had seen. It was different from the way I had imagined documentaries to be. It was full of creativity and originality. And, you know, for a budding filmmaker, it just opened my eyes and opened my heart to different ways of telling stories. It made me realize that this kind of storytelling was full of imagination, and I could be free with exploring the documentary form if I chose that way. It was later on in the 80s, in I believe 1987, that I first met St. Clair Bourne. It was at a panel at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture that was organized by the late Ellis Hazlett. And it was a groundbreaking panel. Stanley Nelson was on it, AJ was on it, and I met St. Clair, and we struck up a conversation. And then after that, all throughout the 80s, I would run into Saint at every single cultural event, every single media event that I went to. And I remember Saint, at one point when we really kind of connected, he said, you're always changing up your look. You're always, I had a mohawk at that time and earrings, and and so he made this comment, and and it was in a non-judgmental way. And what it really, what I thought about later on in retrospect was, it kind of vibed with St. Clair Bourne, because St. Clair Bourne was constantly in the act of recreating himself, his career, his friendships, his relationships. And, because of that, he was easy to be with. There was never any pressure for me to wear a mask with St. Clair Bourne. I think that'll resonate with everyone. And we started a friendship. It was in the 1980s when I really started collaborating with St. Clair Bourne. I had just come back from Canada, and I went to see him and show him this experimental film that I was making. And I was interested in the idea of embracing the African diaspora, but also talking about queer identity, being of two-spirit, and a different type of masculinity, a masculinity that I was engaged in at the time. And St. Clair Bourne told me what I was doing was the right thing. He said that, at that time in the early 90s, that gender and sexuality is where things were going in terms of identity, and that, and St. Clair Bourne was always attuned to the zeitgeist. And, so he gave me permission to be who I was filmically. But, right after that, St. Clair Bourne took me into his office and began teaching me the business of filmmaking. He showed me this program called Now Contact and told me how important it was to maintain one's contact base, to let people know what you're doing, give a context for what you're doing, why you're doing, basically educating people on the type of filmmaking you're engaged in, especially if you're engaged in creative processes of interpreting film and narrative. I went out right after that, and I actually bought a copy of Now Contact. And, and I started that immediately. And what was interesting about that, in light of what's happening right now in terms of social networking, is that that's what St. Clair was engaged in. All this talk about, MyFace and Facebook, St. Clair was actually engaged in that in the early 90s, and it was a part of who he was in terms of his community building. He also introduced me to his publicist, his accountant, his lawyer. And, it was, I would say to St. Clair, and I wasn't the only one. I mean, he embraced all of us, all of the people of my generation of filmmaking and filmmakers in the same way. I would say to Saint, you're doing so much for us. And, his constant refrain was, well, that's okay. Take care of me when I get to be an old man. When you were in St. Clair Bourne's presence, you felt protected, you felt nurtured, you felt like protecting him. I mean, not only was he directly involved in my work, but he was, for me, he was a model. He was a Renaissance man. His ability to be many things at once, activist, journalist, photographer, writer, producer, mentor, student of life, but he was also a fierce warrior. And when we were negotiating a contract with one of the funders, he got into a fight with a guy, and I was like, this is the funder's state, and he actually caused the guy to back up and to redo our contract. And so, it was, he was an indomitable spirit, but at the same time, St. Clair Bourne had this purity of heart that made like, that made, I mean, it was like he approached his projects, he approached everything as if he was discovering it for the first time. Just this past year, St. Clair Bourne was honored by the Pan-African Film Festival in Los Angeles and also by the Pan-African Film Festival in Ghana. And he called me up and he said, hey man, you know, that they're honoring me. And I'm like, you know, you are St. Clair Bourne. But he was humble. And it wasn't, you know, he didn't have this sense of entitlement as much as a sense of generosity of spirit and of discovery. And, you know, as a filmmaker, I try to hold that, you know, dear to me because, you know, there's so much in this business which is ego-driven, you know, which is isolating, you know, which is competitive. And to have someone to give you the model that, you know, that to make change, the only way to make change is as a group. We cannot make change by being, you know, the only one up here, you know? And so that was, you know, that was part of St. Clair Bourne. That was actually, it was St. Clair Bourne. It was in his heart. His humor and his creativity were also in his heart. I just came back from the Sundance Film Festival, and I mentioned to someone at the Black House, there's a new house that St. Clair Bourne would have actually loved in Sundance. It's called the Black House. It's the second year of its running. And I mentioned that St. Clair Bourne was my mentor. And then there were a chorus of people who said, well, he was my mentor too. He was my mentor too. Anthony Jamerson, he said he was his mentor as well. Yvonne Welbin said one of the great things about St. Clair was he is a mentor to so many of us. We all felt like we had a personal, intimate, creative, and business relationship with him. I mean, he tutored us. He told us how to survive in this business of making documentary films with nothing. We have all been blessed by our relationship with this titan. When I first found out that St. Clair Bourne had passed away, I got on the phone with about, I don't know, 30 people, and one of the people said, well, did St. Clair Bourne have any children? And I said, not to my knowledge. And she said, well, who's going to take care of St. Clair Bourne? You know, who's going to take care of him now that he's passed? And for the Black documentary filmmakers of my generation, and we are his heirs and we are his children. St. Clair Bourne, we're keeping the fire alive.
Well, one thing that the present generation has to know is St. Clair, like a lot of black artists of the 60s and 70s, came up in struggle. And so that was what we assumed was the nature of life. Talking about the struggle, I'd like to introduce one of my old comrades in struggle, and who I think St. Clair was getting ready to make a film about the Panthers, and I know he and Kathleen Cleaver had gotten close in the last few years. I'd like to introduce Kathleen Cleaver.
Well, I have to confess that I feel rather uncomfortable standing here because, like many of you, I came here tonight and I'm still in shock at Saint's loss, the loss of Saint. Many of you out there, you knew him as a great friend or a mentor or collaborator. He was a deeply, deeply sensitive person, an amazing artist, and a genuine filmmaker. For the documentary form, he was quite a trailblazer, changing the way blacks were portrayed, as he used to say, from the inside instead of from the outside. He was someone that so many of us worked with, we cared about, we loved him, we admired him. And if you're close to him in age, we certainly never imagined that we'd be sitting here tonight as his memorial. But I heard Saint say so many times, he said, I'm going to be like Langston. People won't really appreciate me until I'm gone. He thought the folk here in New York took him for granted, that to him he was just good old Saint. Well, but I think he was like Langston Hughes in another way. He was a rare spirit who marvelously captured the essence of his time in such a way that we can't help but quote him or reference him to portray that reality if we're going to do it in film, or even if we're going to do it in writing, or we're going to talk about it. The documentary that Saint made about Langston, it was called The Dream Keeper, is one of my favorites, and particularly the final line, which is spoken over a close-up that moves in to Langston's face, and he says, "I'm still here." When Saint celebrated his 60th birthday, and I know many of you were there at that party. He was actually 61 by the time he had the party. Here in Harlem, a few years back, there were so many of the guests that came up to him and said they were so happy to run into their old friends again without having to go to a funeral. So tonight, it's really wonderful to see the faces of so many of all those people here who belonged to that very multifaceted and highly creative and collective community around Saint. So that is something to celebrate, but I really don't feel that this is an occasion for joy. One of the biggest losses that I feel is that we were collaborating on a documentary about the Black Panther Party. To have a film about that movement produced after the work he'd accomplished on the documentary he did about John Henrik Clark, the film he had started but never finished about Stokely Carmichael, that brilliant 2-hour documentary on Paul Robeson, the film he made on Gordon Parks, to have that talent honed onto the story of the Black Panthers would have made it a stunning work. He'd already done several interviews, one with a exiled Panther who'd been living in France for over 30 years. He did an exceptional interview in Ghana with Geronimo Pratt Jijaga. He had a crew, I think it was a two crews, at the 40th anniversary reunion in Oakland of the Black Panther Party back in 2006. He'd conducted interviews with lawyers for the Panthers and several members of the party in New Orleans prior to Katrina. He'd raised money for the script development, and he was in the process of trying to put together a trailer. So I have no clue exactly how that work is going to be finished, since the imagination behind the film has been cut short. So where is that filmmaker who has this understanding of someone like Saint, who was arrested during the Columbia takeover in '68. He walked from jail into the staff of Black Journal, who created his own company, produced and written and directed over 40 films that have examined the Black experience, particularly from the perspective of artists as his life's work. My daughter actually worked with him on the John Henrik Clark film, and she was so surprised when she found out that the fun-loving guy she knew socially was a very demanding taskmaster on the set. She said, "Oh, he's all work," she said. He's a different face from the one she'd seen before. Another thing I'd like to say about Saint is that he was an artist and a man who actually had tremendous respect for strong, independent women. He actually had a fondness for actresses, but we'll let that slide. I met him first back in the 70s. I think it was 1976. I had just come back from living in Algeria and France. I was in the Bay Area, and a mutual friend of ours was having a picnic at Redwood Park in Oakland. And he was out in California because one of his friends was graduating from the University of California. So he was just there visiting. And we met, and we were sitting on a blanket, and all the people just happened to be on that blanket were filmmakers. And guess what we talked about? We talked about a film. We talked about Zabriskie Point, which was a film that I had been in, but because I'd been out of the country, I'd never seen it. Some 16 years after that conversation, we met again, and this time we met in New York. he wanted to get my input on a script that he was working on with Ron Milner for a documentary about the case of imprisoned Black Panther Geronimo. Soon after that, we became a couple. We spent over 9 years together, years during which I think his creative abilities were reaching their peak. His acknowledgement in the film world was expanding. During that time, he created in New York the Black Documentary Collective and counterpart during the time he based himself out in Los Angeles. But like a true New Yorker, he had to come back here. He was invited to curate a segment of the Full Frame Film Festival down in North Carolina. Saint introduced me to film festivals. The first time I ever went out with him, we went to the African Film Festival here at Lincoln Center. He continued to take me to film festivals, particularly if a film of his was being shown, like in Toronto. And it was that experience that inspired me and taught me how to start the International Black Panther Film Festival that we did here in Harlem for several years, which would never had the caliber and impact it did if Saint hadn't been involved in the nuts and bolts and sort of teaching me as much as he did about film and production and how to make a high-quality event happen. I think there are very few of us here who have a full handle on how extensive the man's influence was, because what each of us knows is merely just one or two facets of this extraordinary artist. Well, I'm still having trouble processing the reality that Saint's gone. I was out in California and I got a phone call. I didn't see him in the hospital. We exchanged a few phone calls, but there wasn't ever any sense of anxiety on my part about what was happening, because I was pretty sure he was going to get out and go into rehab like we all thought. So for me, I guess I'll just have to say that he's just MIA, missing in action. Thank you.
We also have some very old people in the house. I'm going to introduce one of them now, who himself is a very famous filmmaker, old friend, Melvin Van Peebles.
When they asked me, would I talk, I said, you know, don't start me to talk and I'll tell everything I know. They said, okay. Well, it ain't a lot, but here goes. First, Saint was my N-word, if you understand what I mean. Saint was me, okay? When I got the call from Sam Pollard that Saint was gone, I had a pain in my stomach. The first time I felt that pain was years ago when I was a little boy back in Chicago, and my mama told me that my grandmama was dead. Anyway, I'm a tough guy. In fact, the first time I met Saint, we were in Oberlin College, and somebody heckled me in the audience. I went down and kicked their ass. And I thought that because Saint looked like such a saintly person, I thought that was the end of our friendship. He just chuckled, and we've been pals ever since. That's how we met. Well, what to do about this pain? First, I tried my status, intellectual, agnostic, atheist, machin truc, etc., etc. None of us get out of here alive. Life is that way. It didn't work. So then I tried the scientific approach. Well, a star has helium. helium adds one element and it becomes hydrogen. From hydrogen you go to deuterium, and deuterium and all these other things form all of the other elements that we know, which we are made up of. And so we're just part of elements going around in this chaos. But that didn't make me feel any better either. And then I remember back, Grandma. And I was in bed, and we had a three-room apartment on the 3rd floor next to the elevator on 58th Street in Chicago. My mother had 6 sisters, and they all lived there with their husbands, too, and their children, so you can imagine the size. The 3 rooms were very crowded. And I'd gone to bed, and I heard this screaming, this hollering. And I came out. I said, Mama, Mama, what's going on? She says, Grandmama was shouting her up to heaven. That's what we used to do. They used to shout people up to heaven. They used to shout them to heaven. Now, I know Sean Clair's done the documentaries, the BA and the AB and the da-da-da-da-da-da. But we're part of all that we've met, and I got to go back to the roots. I haven't gotten so intellectual, so intelligent, so distant that I can't go back. Back to that pain. And Sinclair, if you get to heaven, somebody, some of you will probably. Huh? I have a few indiscretions on my record, which will probably keep me off that book, okay? But when you get there, I want you to tell Jesus or St. Peter, whoever's at the gate, for me and for you, Sinclair had a PhD in loving. He had a PhD in loving all of us. PhD in all of, that's what Sinclair had. That's why we're here. Now, please, forget that we're in the Riverside Church and you got on the suits, and so put back on the overalls. I want to hear an amen. Sinclair Bourne had a PhD in loving. Sinclair had a PhD in loving. Sinclair had a PhD in loving all of us. Thank you.
Now have the eulogy by Sinclair's sister, Judith Bourne.
First, I'd like to read a message from California, since St. kept going out there. The members of the Black Association of Documentary Filmmakers West send our sincere condolences for your loss. It is certainly our loss as well, for as our founder, St. Clair was the beacon that gave us and countless others invaluable direction, guidance, and inspiration throughout the years. His devotion to filmmaking, integrity with his craft, and commitment to organize artists created a high standard by which all of us can be measured. And we are grateful that he raised the bar. Although we have lost a brother, rest assured that his intention and spirit live on in our continued effort. Respectfully, Bad Filmmakers West, Los Angeles, California. I was to give a eulogy. As many of you may know, Saint and I lost our parents in 1999. And I did the eulogies on both of those occasions, and he did the obituaries. It never occurred to me that I would be doing something like this for him this soon. Well, let me first say, this is not going to be a normal eulogy, because this entire program is his eulogy. Everyone here that has spoken, that has contributed, those people who have written tributes in the booklet, those persons who have called me, who have emailed me, who have spoken to each other, all those friends that have known Saint and have shared his memories and have shared what he has meant to their lives, is his eulogy. I'm going to tell you some things that you probably don't know about him, that often come from his early life, may give a little insight into what he did later. I first met Saint in early July of 1945. I really don't know what he first said to me, but I'm fairly sure I didn't respond in words. Although he was the firstborn, he was actually the survivor of twins, of Gwendolyn Bourne, who was originally of Antigua, West Indies, and St. Clair T. Bourne, so Saint was not a junior. And our father's family, parents had emigrated from Barbados. So we are 1.5 generation Americans. Now, the stories that were told in the family indicate that he always had a very gregarious nature from the time he was a toddler. And his baby pictures, some of which you see there, show a very friendly and cheerful child. Now, when I came along 2.5 years later, like many older brothers, he loved to tease his baby sister. Well, my first clear memory of him, he must have been around 8, because I was probably about 5 or 6. And we were in our living room on McDonough Street in Brooklyn. And he'd been teasing me, but I didn't like it. But he was always a lot bigger than me. So there wasn't too much I could do about it while he was teasing me. But he lost interest, and he sort of wandered off someplace in the room. He wasn't paying any attention to me. So I put my head down, and I ran across the room and I butted him. He was shocked, but he wasn't hurt. Interestingly, though, he did not retaliate. But he never teased me like that again either. Now, a couple of years later, he became fascinated with the stories of the Knights of the Round Table. And he used to make we had a couple of toy knights and their squires and their horses and things of that sort, which he made out of aluminum foil, which we crinkled up and packed together, and toothpicks and these little sticks and string and cardboard and stuff like that. And he taught me to do it. And we spent hours on all of these storylines that we made up as we went along. So for him, apparently, acting, or rather, actually writing out scripts came later. But even then, he was making up the stories. We both went to and graduated from the Holy Rosary Elementary School in Brooklyn. Some people from Rosary said they were going to be here. I'm glad to see them here. But then Saint, as Tanoa mentioned, went to Xavier High School in Manhattan. While he was there, we have some Xavier people here too. Okay. But while he was there, he joined the Drum and Bugle Corps as a drummer, because he had been in the Boy Scouts and he was a drummer. But he didn't stay a drummer very long. He became a drum major. The Drum and Bugle Corps was a marching band, and they competed in these tournaments around the city with marching bands which made all of these intricate maneuvers and stuff like that. Well, Saint started devising these maneuvers, which had to go with the music. And there were certain kinds of bugles, and there were certain kinds of drums, and then they marched in different places, and they moved around, and then they end up in various configurations and all of that in accord with the music. And he did that, and he did it out on graph paper. And then he taught them how to do this. And he was the drum major because he had to direct it. So it occurred to me that this may well have been his first sustained experience as a director. Saint always looked at the big picture. He admitted that, and Bill Grecian would know this, and Lou Potter will know this, they can confirm this, that the reason he became a producer so quickly at Black Journal, because he was a lousy assistant producer, director. Because the assistant directors were responsible for the details. They had to make sure everything got done. But Saint wasn't interested in the details. He was interested in the big picture. So he would sort of forget about what he was supposed to be doing, and he'd be there talking about, well, why don't we do this? And maybe, talk about the conception of it and all. Fortunately, his ideas were seen as having value, so he was promoted rather than being fired. Saint's dedication to film was not, I'm convinced, a career choice. It was what he was born to do. And at times, this was painful for us in the family because there were many times when his income was minimal, sometimes just really non-existent. My parents would worry that he didn't have anything else to fall back on. And I noted, and it was not necessarily at the time with admiration, that Saint only had two really great talents. He made great films, and he made great friends. But those two things were enough to fill his life and the life of many others. While I loved his films, I didn't like the fact that they didn't provide him with an ongoing financial security. But to say the lack of money was an inconvenience. And it was inconvenient basically because it made it more difficult for him to make the films he wanted and the films that he planned in his head. And he always had at least 10 projects in his head at any one time. Whenever you ask Saint what he wanted, what could you do for him, he'd say, give me a 3-picture deal. Well, Saint is our 42-picture deal. That's what he has given to us. 'Cause, 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 I ask that all of us do several things that he did. Embrace all people who are or try to be authentic persons. Expose the scams and have fun. Thank you.
I'd like to bring up the last speaker, who's an old friend, the writer Tulani Davis.
There have been a lot of words, and just to bring it full circle, I'm going to say I first met Saint 40 years ago in that building in Columbia when we took it over, Hamilton High. I didn't get to know him well then, but I did come to know him through one of the many families of St. Clair Bourne that is here tonight, and that is the filmmaking family. I was tempted to ask you all to stand up, but I will just say, to the right of you and the left of you, there are people in this room who make films. We are, in our sadness, here to celebrate Saint, and it's also a pleasure to celebrate Saint, but it would mean just a little less if we do not support his family when we leave, those who write the films, direct the films, fund the films, those who hold the cameras, the lights. This is Saint's family about which you've heard so much tonight, and I know that this is the living Saint that is still in the room. I would like to give a kind of a prayer. We didn't know him to be prayerful in the Christian sense, and I'm a Buddhist, and we don't really pray either. So this is a moment of silence, a moment of meditation, to wish Saint well as he returns to the scientific universe Melvin mentioned, or to God, if that's how you look at it. We Buddhists think they're the same thing, so as he returns to the universe that gave him to us, I would just make this prayer. More than anything in Saint's work, and in the work of all those he encouraged, was a documentation of the struggle of African American people, in particular in this land. May it continue. If there was something we were leaving to Saint and letting him do it instead of doing it ourselves, now's the time to pick it up. If it was building a body of work, let's build it. If it was telling the stories of those whose stories are seldom told, let's tell them. If it was building a network among us, a community of people who are struggling against all these difficulties that have been mentioned tonight, let's build it. If it was to spread the news of good work done by someone else who does the same thing that we do, one of those things that Saint did, let's pick it up. There's lots to take up from all that he carried for us. Let's do that. Let's mentor. Let's build our body of work. There are so many in here who I know work very hard and are building that body of work, but don't be discouraged. Let us just realize that that work comes from compassion for humanity. Our life is filled with warmth in sharing with others. It is a simple truth to learn, but a difficult practice to fully realize. In personal life, it means to act by placing ourselves in the position of another. And in community life, it means to give service with joy and gratitude for the betterment of all. We have been fortunate, having lived in a time, as they described it in the Ramayana, when even the monks had to run and tell the king, there are so many demons, they are so thick in the forest that we cannot find silence or a place to pray. And we have been fortunate to know many selfless people, many people who gave their lives to social change, many people who gave up their lives to social change. Saint was among them, Saint knew them, Saint documented them. So the practice of doing for others is one that we have been fortunate to know, but one that we must teach. It is based upon the clear understanding that life is oneness. In deep gratitude, let us realize this oneness of all life, the heart of which is compassion. May the infinite light of wisdom and compassion so shine within us that the errors and vanities of self may be dispelled. So shall we understand the changing nature of existence and awaken to spiritual peace. Thank you very much. Good night.